Our topic today, strategic workforce planning, staying ahead, future forward. And I tend to use COVID-19 as a lead-in because COVID-19 has caused all of us to look within our organizations, and there's a lot of restructuring. There's going to be a lot of business model changing. There's going to be a lot of strategy changing. If strategy shifts, everything else cascades down. So my presentation will be centered around that. I've worked on large-scale strategic workforce planning projects throughout the world. I just finished one in Zurich, 150 HR people, custom designed strategic workforce plan. And they were building for the future of the bank. And it was all facets of the bank. We had analytical people, we had HR business partners, we had the whole gamut of the HR department. And they realized that COVID-19 has caused them to rethink their business. Technology is making huge shifts inside of their organization as well as inside of their industry. So that kind of put everything on warp speed and moving forward. So what we'll talk about, over the next 20, 30 minutes is talking about strategic workforce planning and the role it plays in organizations today. If you follow the business news, you know that for the most part, organizations are probably in the third phase. So my slide says the 3 R's of COVID. And for the most part, we're in the reimagine stage. And that not only includes working from home, working from anywhere, Zoom meetings all day, technological advances and things like that. It also means strategies being looked at. It also means that certain business units may possibly be changing. It also means that in a lot of cases, companies are going to have to move towards technology a lot more. I read an article a while back about a car dealer who had just built their e-commerce model right before the lockdown, and their sales actually increased. And then they contrasted that to auto dealers who were in the process, but maybe was a year or so away from putting together an e-commerce model. So from a strategic workforce planning perspective, the car dealer that moved forward had not only the technology, but people that were capable of building that out. What strategic role would have been necessary to build out that e-commerce model? And the ones that were behind the 8 ball and they realized they've got to build it, now they're trying to speed up the process. So COVID has caused businesses to reimagine. And as a result of that, what happens is that we face this. Now, this slide I like to use because of the fact that it shows everyone so-called at the table, and I despise that phrase, but if our strategy shifts, if our model shifts, everyone is coming to the table with a strategy, from operating unit to technology to marketing to the finance department. What is HR's role in strategic workforce planning and trying to make sure we have adequate talent and capabilities within our organization to carry that strategy forward? And that's why it's come to the forefront today in organizations, because everyone is trying to figure out, what are we going to look like in 3 years? What are we going to look like in 5 years? This process that was kind of sitting back, we have to speed up that process. Where do we find the people to make that happen? So here's another way of looking at it. For a successful organization, anchoring SWP to the organization. Business strategy, people strategy, human capital strategy, business results. Now more than ever, people strategy has to be baked in. Now, a lot of cases it was not that, because if you pull out people strategy, it was business strategy and they were looking for results. I gave this presentation with this slide to a business university, grad school, and people were actually shocked in the audience because they had never given consideration to the people side of strategy. They spent time on their courses and building up strategic knowledge, but there was no time spent on linking it to people throughout. So when we walked through this, I got more questions on this slide than ever. The professor told me, I've never seen it presented that way. I've never seen this type of a slide. And what I thought about was the schools, the business schools across the world that is training the next level of leaders, and they don't walk through or give them access to the thinking of linking people to the business unit and making sure or giving us a higher probability of success for business results once we link all of that together. So why is that important? It's important because when we look at headlines today, and all of these headlines that I picked up over the past year or so, each one of these will require a different look at their workforce plan. GE announced a shakeup, transition to electric cars by 2025. I just read earlier today that Land Rover made their announcement, and by 2030, it will be an all-electric vehicle. So mechanical engineers and the people that were building cars before, that may switch. That strategic role may switch to more of a computer engineer. That will have a ripple effect back to auto parts stores. If we're fully electric, the parts that were used in that prior iteration of cars will not be used anymore, and that business may shrink. So it's affecting every organization, and this is why time should be spent on strategic workforce planning. I read an article yesterday about an organization who was able to present their strategic workforce plan. They went from manpower planning numbers to strategic as to why do you need 10 people or whatever it is? What is the strategy? Who's driving it? And what they realized when they did that it was so important that now it's a part of the normal business planning process. Strategic workforce planning is now baked into that. Now that's the ultimate transition point for a strategic workforce planner. So I got a picture here of Facebook, Google signed 6-year deal and new car connectivity and cloud services. Where are you going to find those people inside of Ford? Did Ford have those people that understands in-car connectivity? What specific skill is that? What school is turning out those type engineers? What do we know about those engineers? How do we find those engineers? Do we have a strong value proposition that people would want to come and work for a Ford versus working for a Tesla? If we see a strong commitment between Ford and Google, that kind of increases the talent pool. So maybe there's engineers in the tech sector that we can bring into the auto sector. And this is the way we'd have to look at it. So when you look at business headlines, and I tend to ask this whenever I run these sessions, I take a poll inside of the room, and I ask people, how many of you read your business section of whatever news, wherever you get your news from? And for the most part, I get kind of the HR look. They're looking at each other and they don't really read it. So I'm saying to them, in order for you to understand business, in order for you to increase your business acumen, understand what's happening in business. When you see these deals signed, think under it, look under the hood, read into that 1,200 word article to see what it says, the strategic direction, and how, if you were in that company and you were in charge of either the HR VP for that client or strategic workforce planning, what may you need, or what will you possibly need to make sure this works? Because we have to anchor it to strategy. It has to be anchored to strategy. The days of just creating it and moving forward is not going to work anymore. So let's think of this. What are the workforce implications? If you looked at the prior headlines, what would be the workforce implications? If we figure out the workforce implications, we could figure out what the strategic roles may be, of what audience would be impacted, and when I say audience, what particular department would be impacted by that strategic shift. And then we look at it from the nucleus perspective. Whatever that strategy is, whatever that new model is, we look around to see what people are connected to it. What are the data points that are connected to it? And that's what I call the 2 Qs approach. In solving a problem, you need to follow the 2 Qs. You need qualitative information and you need quantitative So you need data and you need information. So you figure out who do you need to talk to get better clarity on the prior deal. What is that going to mean and how's that going to impact the workforce inside of Ford and inside of Google? How is that partnership going to work? Do we understand everything we need to understand about that? And then we can go outside and say, what's happening in the auto industry? It doesn't take a PhD to figure out that since General Motors the other week announced they were going all electric, all the other car companies are coming out now and giving their date. So there's a huge transformation. And the auto industry has more transformation in that industry than any other industry. New car models, new ways of buying cars. I can buy a car online and they can deliver it downstairs. So the road is going to be steep, but if we stay abreast of what's going on in our roles within an organization and making sure that we understand our client. Now you heard me use the term client. I did not misspeak, because the client that you're sitting with, if you're an HRBP and you're sitting in marketing, or if you're sitting in engineering, you have to become a student of that process. You have to become a student of your industry. You have to become a student of the process. Is that technology? You have to become a student of it, because you're going to have to build or architect, which is a term I like to use. You're going to have to architect the people strategy to make sure the strategic goals of that organization are met, are close to being met. So business strategy. What do we want to achieve post-COVID? What roles are going to be instrumental in executing that business strategy? If it shifts, the roles may shift. As the auto industry was making the transition years ago, they realized that the mechanical engineer was cool at one time, but now it's shifting to the computer engineer. Because if you look at a car, everything now is computerized. So we need to make sure that we had those engineers in place. But if we think of every other car company is doing the same thing, every other car company is looking for these same people. And this is why the better we understand it, the better we understand the source of talent, where we're going to find these people. Do we have the right branding that they're going to want to be a part of that? So there's a lot of moving parts once we identify it. But as I said, we have to become a student of the strategic workforce planning process in our company, as well as the industry. And then we figure out the roles, we figure out the competencies that's going to be needed. I give an example. I did some work for a company in Saudi Arabia, and they are heavy into oil exploration. The strategic role, drone developers. But here's the twist. They wanted drone developers who have designed underwater drones, competencies, skills, capabilities of that role. Not only just drone developers can build them to go into the sky, but also to be able to underground exploration. This is what I mean when I said, if that happened in your organization, you'd have to know everything there is to know about drone developers. What schools are pumping out drone developers? What are the different levels of drone developers in that job cluster? That's the first time I'd ever heard of that. And matter of fact, I spent some time with him after that, because I said, I want to write a case study around that, because that's unique, specifically as it relates to workforce planning. So the other key point is that we should understand is what's happening in our organization, what's happening as it relates to our SWOT analysis. So again, becoming a student of strategic workforce planning, I need to understand the strategic shift. I need to understand the SWOT of our organization. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the opportunities? And what are the threats? When I run workshops sometime, I have my HRBPs to use the SWOT analysis to analyze their client. If they're sitting in marketing, once a year, go through this process with the client. And every time they do it, the client comes back and says, pretty good exercise. I really like that, because I never thought of using a SWOT analysis to look inside of my department. But if I do that, I understand strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And specifically, if I'm driving a role, I'm driving one of the roles that's going to be needed for that strategic shift, it's hugely important that we understand that from our side. So I use this slide when I did the Switzerland project, because I'm talking to the audience were financial people, the audience were numbers people. And I said, what if we track talent trends the same way we do industry trends or customer trends? We invest in talent. It's not a cost factor. We invest in talent. We invest in people that's going to drive revenue. So when we look at the strategic role, which part of it will they own? Changing workforce demographics, COVID-19 implications, changing skill requirements. What is your organization willing to leave to chance? And when you throw that question out there and you think of an investment portfolio in strategic roles, this is where it becomes important. And this was a huge hit when we looked at and we did a little workout exercise, around this particular slide. Now I throw this here not because we're going to talk cooking, or we're going to talk and explain more about this. I use this slide. I don't know what this is too, by the way, but I thought it looked beautiful when I looked at it. The coloring was great. So why would I use recipe in a strategic workforce planning slide? I use recipe as it relates to any model, because if you go online and you were to search for a chocolate chip cookie recipe, you may find 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. But if we all took one and baked it, the business outcome would be cookies. Next time around, I may tweak it, and maybe I add the little nuts with it. Maybe I add coconut or walnuts, pecans, or whatever it is. We tweak it next time around. So I say that to say, use a model. Use a model, use a recipe. You get acclimated to using that. The next time around, you can make adjustments, because the context of the next challenge you may face, in some parts of that, you may be able to skip over it. So what we're going to do now is walk through the model, the HCI model, the HCI recipe. It covers everything. So we start from strategy and then we work our way through. So Einstein said it takes, if you had 60 minutes to solve a problem, you take 55 minutes to understand what that problem is. I like that because of the fact this is the 55 minutes. What is the strategy? What does the new model look like? And if we think of that new model, what are the roles that are going to be needed? What's happening outside, externally, in the marketplace? What does it look like inside? What's the DNA of our workforce? Average age, tenure. That's the DNA of our workforce. What does the culture look like? And then we think in terms of, what is this scenario? Are we going to become an e-commerce company? Are we going to start selling cars online, gradually shifting to that? Well, if we do that, we don't need all of the facilities we have, the big showrooms and all of that, because the new customer may say, I can order the car here and it'll be delivered to my house by Friday. I never have to leave my couch. Do we have that capability? Because if that's targeted future state, we have to build for that. So we look at current state, future state, we subtract those two, we're going to get gaps. So let's just walk through that. And action planning is the other. And then we're back to monitor reporting. So I go through each one of these slowly. Corporate strategy, business strategy. What is the marketing's role in that strategic link? What is finance's role in that strategic link? So every department theoretically could have a role in corporate strategy. And that would change as the strategy shifted. So that department needs certain people. What are the workforce implications? What is the competitive advantage for us moving into that business? If we developed an e-commerce model pre-COVID and we're coming out, we have a strong competitive advantage because we're kind of first to the marketplace and we are working very, very diligently. Numbers were up, numbers were increasing. How do we increase that? What roles would be needed? And that comes down to workforce implications. So what are the workforce implications in each one of those departments or underlying each one of those pieces of strategy? And then we think about critical roles. Critical roles. Is it the revenue producing agent? Or is it a digital transformation, the person that's going to be driving the transformation of the organization? That may not be revenue based at this time, but that's more of a future state. And that role is critical, but it doesn't have revenue impact. So when we look at critical role, how are we analyzing the critical roles? And I always tell people, if you're telling me that you've identified critical roles, I'm going to say, the question I'm going to ask you, how did you identify those roles? When I did work for this particular client, they told me in the initial discussion, when I asked the question, they said, we have 88 strategic roles. I said, there's no way any organization has 88 strategic roles. And we'll see how that works out. So my question was, how did you arrive at 88? What criteria, what amount of rigor did you use to realize that you needed 88 people in different functions to be a strategic role? So we go through this process and it kind of filters out some of those, because I said, you're going to need to be able to explain that. If you were presenting to a senior team and they told you that, how did you choose these roles for strategic roles? I said, if you can't answer that, you've lost the room. So think in terms of how can I tell the story about the role and connect the role to the strategy. And that's what we think about when we look at that part of the recipe for critical role analysis. And then we talk about environmental scan. I like to use the auto industry because there's a lot of change that's going on in that industry. But think of retail. What is the retail environment going to look like in 3 to 5 years? As you know, impacted in the US, there's a lot of stores that were closing. They were closing a lot of locations. They may still be in business, but they have to ramp up digital transformation. Websites and e-commerce models and paywalls and all these kinds of things that they've got to build in now. Every retail store is doing the same thing. So what is happening in your industry? My other so-called Ronism, you have to become a student of your industry. You should join this association. You should go to these industry conferences if you can. See what's happening, see who's leading it, try and figure out where you are in the process. If these two companies are the ones and number two, where would your organization rank? And you look back at your strategy, are we going to make it to be able to compete? And because if they have the competitive advantage of already being there, how are we going to kind of ease into that? Everybody else is trying to do the same thing. So the environmental scan is important. One of the other things you can do is to log on and register at all the big sites, the Korn Ferries of the world, EYs, Accenture, and you choose strategic workforce planning because you have to become a student of strategic workforce planning. It's not a one-off exercise. You got to live, eat, breathe, and sleep it to become better at using this particular process and using a recipe to try and build out or architect the workforce plan for your organization. Current state analysis. This is another question I asked. So give me the DNA of your organization. What is the average age? HR look. What is the average tenure at your organization? HR look again. I was vice president of human resources for Martha Stewart. Our average age was 27. Our average manager's age was 32. On average, each person there was 1.5 jobs out of college. 72% of our workforce was female. 53% of the female workforce were of childbearing age. You heard me right. We had to figure this out because we were trying to close a gap, and the gap centered around new mothers who were not returning to work. Our turnover was very high in that sector. That was the pain point. And in order to solve that, we need to figure out what would be the impact of the 72% and the 52% in doing that. So that's a stat. And I still remember those. And I'll ask these questions inside of a group, and I get a look. I get a look to say, they may be able to give me one. What is a tenure? Because if the tenure is long-term tenure and you're going through rapid change, that you may have a resistance block there because we've been doing this for 15 years one way, and now you want to come in and change everything. So the Lewin's model of force and resistance, equal amount this way, equal pushback this way. But if I understand that, I can do some groundwork to bring that change initiative along. And that's why it's important. And this is going to be the factor from current state, and we go to future state, and you subtract those two, and that's where it comes in. So the next ingredient is targeted future state. So this is always kind of a fun exercise. You're not going to lead this, but you should be somewhere in the room, or you should kind of figure out, where's our industry headed? What is the scenario of 1, 2, 3, 4? Which one are we more apt to do as an organization? Targeted future state. One of those is NCFS, no change future state. The graveyard is full of organizations who use that as a strategy. We don't need to change. We've got this. Think of Blockbuster. Think of BlackBerry. BlackBerry, when the iPhone came out, they said that's a gimmick. We're not worried about that. Blockbuster says we have a larger footprint than McDonald's. We're not worried about that. And you see what happened. So every organization is in a constant state of change and trying to figure out, what is this scenario going to look like? We need to understand that. Or maybe talk with somebody inside of our organization so we can kind of figure out where we're headed. Is it an e-commerce model? How are we going to build it out? Is it retrenchment from a certain region? What's going to happen as a result of that? So this next slide here gives you kind of some insights as to how that would look, a little more beef behind it. NCFS is the last one there. Targeted future state is what we're going to look at. So if we have targeted future state, we know where we're going to go. And we have current state, where we are now. How big is the gap? And what are we going to need to close that gap? So that's a scenario planning process, and the gaps could look like this. We could have 5, 6, 7 gaps. Prioritize those gaps. Which one is more aligned to making sure we connect to the strategic thrust of the organization? So this is why I said the model is logical, because it kind of goes around in a circle. You're not going to miss anything. And then next time, depending upon the context or the strategic shift, some parts of this may not play as an important role in your next iteration of it. So what we try and do is make sure we understand this and we consistently monitor, which is another step. The action plan. Now that means more than just creating a checklist. That means we're going to create a checklist, and we're going to make sure we bring that to life. What is your plan? You've been working on putting all of this together. You've been spending the 55 minutes. You've identified the gaps, and now you're ready to put it in an action plan. I'm gonna give you a quote that I read from a survey of C-suite leaders as it related to human resource initiatives. They said, you don't monitor anything. You don't measure anything. How can an organization operate if you don't measure? What was the sales for the week? What was the sales for the month? Are we trending upwards? Are we trending downwards? If you look at action planning, sometimes it's just kind of a checklist. And so do we have KPIs that we can measure? Within 6 months, we need to be here. Within 7 months, we need to be here. Determine a solution to close the gaps you've identified, engage stakeholders and resources to develop the plan. Change management, which is what I've been doing all this week. How is that change management cycle going to look? So change management is operating here. Strategic workforce planning is operating here. You've got strategy operating from here. Our role is very important today, and we're in the driver's seat, and we're the ones that's going to make this happen because we're the only ones inside of the organization that has this expertise. Gap could look something like this. You've noticed on my right, I have timeline. By second quarter, by third quarter, I can measure this. Our goal is to be here by this. Future state says 70%. The other was 20% and 10%. I can measure that weekly. I can measure that monthly. And when I come back to give you a recap as to where we are, I can tell you a story and walk you through the entire process. Monitor and evaluate. I call it pulse. What's the cadence? Weekly? Bi-weekly? Monthly? Where are we? Where do we need to be? Can you walk me through? Can you tell me the story behind it? And this is the cadence sheet here. Depends upon the initiative that you're working with to make it happen. But we have to have a thorough understanding of our organization because they need our help. And this is why we're where we are. And all these things are affecting us in some way, whether it be role changes, skill changes, worker preferences, build versus buy, the 5 Bs, 6 Bs, whichever way you want to call it. In other words, where's the talent coming from? So one of the things we work on is this. I say at the end of the session, you will be able to do this. And this is what you can present from. SWP on a page. Current state, future state, what's driving it, here's the initiatives. I don't need 10 slides. I can pull this up and I can tell you a story. And that story would say, here's how we're going to accomplish this because our strategy is here. And for this initiative, here's what we're going to do. And here's our entire strategic workforce planning model on one page. And I can talk to one page. I don't need 20 slides to talk to. People are slide out. Be able to tell the story and be able to guide your organization in the proper direction that it needs to be successful. And with that, I thank you very much. As we said earlier, it's 11:30, I think, here in Dubai, but I was so honored to be asked to come here and talk about strategic workforce planning and the importance it plays inside of organizations. So thank you very much.